Okay, we are live on YouTube, and now we will record. Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. This is Parashat Bechukotai, and today is Lag BaOmer. So I have two insights I want to give over. And the second one will be related. It's related to the Parsha, and it's perfectly related to Lag BaOmer also. So we'll start with the first verse in this Parsha, which says, Im bechukotai telechu, ve'et mitzvotai tishmaru, ve'asitem otam. If you walk in my decrees and my mitzvot you guard and you do them. And then it continues, V'natati gishmechem be'itam, I will give you your rains in their right time. V'natna ha'aretz yevula, and the land will give forth its produce. And the trees of the field will give forth their fruit. It continues with beautiful blessings. And then, and all of this is if you walk in my ways and you guard my mitzvot and you do them. And then the Parsha changes tone completely and says, if you don't walk in my ways, if you don't do the mitzvot, and you don't observe them, then there's a series of horrific curses that will occur. This is a classic example of, we have free will here. None of the curses had to happen or have to happen. But it's very, very similar to the dynamic of cause and effect and measure for measure. The Torah is presenting here a reward and punishment type of dynamic. And it's in our hands to choose what way we're going to go. So let's understand how Rashi explains this first verse. The first verse is, if you walk in my, so usually bechukotai comes from the word chok. And a chok is usually described as a type of mitzvah that doesn't have an apparent logical meaning. In other words, many of the mitzvot are very obvious why we would be commanded to do them. And there are other mitzvot that we don't actually know the most essential reason for them. We can propose ideas why we were commanded to do this mitzvah, but many of them supersede or transcend normative logic. That's usually what a chok means. It's a type of mitzvah that supersedes normative logic. But Rashi is bothered by the language here, and he wants to know, what does bechukotai mean here? My commandments, my decrees. Because right after it says, ve'et mitzvotai tishmaru, and you guard my mitzvot. So Rashi learns from this, it can't be that bechukotai means what we usually think of it meaning as a type of mitzvah, because the next thing it says, and you guard my mitzvahs and you do them. So Rashi says, therefore, what I learned from this is walking in the decrees of God is what he calls amal b'Torah, being involved in learning Torah. That's what we're being told here. If you are involved in learning my Torah, and you guard the mitzvot and you do them, then the string of blessings will come to you. And none of the curses ever have to happen. But God is setting up these spiritual laws, just like there are laws of nature, physical laws of the universe. There are also spiritual laws of cause and effect, of mida keneged mida, of measure for a measure. So this is what Rashi says. This is how he understands the first verse. I'm going to bring a few other explanations of what we can learn from this first verse, and also the second verse, which says that if you do the mitzvah and you guard them and you are involved in the Torah, God promises to bring rain in its time. The word geshem, rain, is more than just physical rain that waters the earth. The word in Hebrew for all physicality, all materialism, is gashmiut, from the word geshem, rain. Rain represents all physical blessing. And so the Baal HaTurim says an interesting thing. If you look at the end of last week's Parsha, and this is a typical type of commentary based on juxtaposition, Rashi many times begins a Parsha by saying, what is the connection with the end of the previous Parsha and this Parsha? Here he doesn't do that, but the Baal HaTurim does. So the last verse of the previous Parsha, Bahar, is Et Shabbotai Tishmaru Umikdashi Tira'u Ani Hashem. My Shabboses you shall guard, and my holy place, my temple, you should have awe of it. I am God. And so the Baal HaTurim connects it with a statement in the Gemara, because here God promises to bring the rain in its time. So the simple understanding is in its time, meaning in the season that it will help the agriculture in Israel. For those who know, Israel has, the year is split climactically, that from approximately October through April is the rainy season. Can come even in September, it can wait till November, and it could even stretch into May. But the rainy season is pretty much half the year. And then once the rains stop, usually there's no rain for 5 or 6 months, completely dry. So that's the simple understanding. I'll give you rain in the season where it can do the most productive for the land, for agriculture. But the sages also say that even during the rainy season, rain is a great blessing, but it's also a big hassle. Like when it rains, it stops a lot of activities, traffic jams, floods, mud, the whole business. So it says that the best time for rain is Friday nights, because Friday night, most people are home observing the Shabbat. People aren't here, there, and everywhere. And so the Baal HaTurim connects the end of the previous Parsha, where it says, my Shabboses you shall guard. And then it says, I will bring you rain in its season. So if we guard Shabbat and we observe Shabbat, then God will bring the rain not only in its right season, but even the time of the week when it doesn't bother people the most. So that's an explanation from the Baal HaTurim. He also says that in the blessings that will follow here, they're given over in 10 verses. 10 verses. And the Baal HaTurim connects these blessings with the blessings that Yitzchak gives to Yaakov before he sends him off to look for a wife. That's when Yaakov comes in and he, in a sense, pretends to be Esav, and he procures the blessings for himself. And so in that blessing, there are 10 words. There are 10 words in the opening of the blessing. And then the blessing continues, and we're told that in a very, very short blessing, there are actually 10 blessings. So the Baal HaTurim says that those blessings that Yitzhak gave to Yaakov in the first verse is just 10 words. And then the whole blessing, which is, I'm going to find it here right now. Just 1 second. V'yiten lecha Elokim mital hashemayim u'mishamnei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirosh. That God should give, this is the blessing of Yitzchak to Yaakov, that God will give you from the dew of heaven and the fatness or the productiveness of the earth, and an abundance of grain and wine. And then there's just really one more sentence. Ya abducha amin v'yishtachavu lecha le'umim v'havei gevirach le'achecha v'yishtachavu lecha b'nei imecha orarecha arur u'mavarechecha baruch. That nations will come and serve you and prostrate themselves to you, and you will be an authority to your brother, and he will bow to you, the sons of your mother. Cursed are those that curse you, and blessed are those that bless you. So in there's actually 10 different blessings, even though it's only 2 short verses. So that's what the Baal HaTurim says. I learned from Rav Ginsburg that in the whole Torah, this blessing that Yitzhak gives to Yaakov is the most powerful of all of them. And here we see in our Parashat Bechukotai, they're expanded. These 2 verses, in a sense, are expanded in 10 verses. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story. This is really one of my favorite stories, and I used to tell it to my children, and they love this story. They love this story, and you'll see shortly how connected it is to the Parsha. So this is the story of the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh. He was a great, great luminary in Morocco. He made Aliyah to Israel in the middle 1700s. And according to tradition, one of the main reasons that the Baal Shem Tov wanted to come to Israel is that he felt that if he could get together with the Ohr HaChaim, they could bring Mashiach. For those who are attending our Tuesday classes, we're learning the life and the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. We've already discussed this idea. So we can imagine what a level the Ohr HaChaim was on, that the Baal Shem Tov felt that if he could get together with him, they could bring Mashiach. To this day, there is a street in the old city of Jerusalem called the Ohr HaChaim Street, and the original Beit Midrash of the Ohr HaChaim still exists there. Still exists. So this is a story of the Ohr HaChaim. The Ohr HaChaim lived in Morocco, and he, at a young age, he was already recognized as a great chacham, a wise person. He became the Rav of the town where he lived, and he was also a shochet. He was also a ritual slaughter. And his custom was every Friday, he would slaughter a cow and give the meat and prepare the meat and give it to poor people, especially poor students or rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim. At one point, there was a disease among the cows. And one Friday, all he could get was one cow. That's all he could get. And it was a sizable city, and he had a huge Jewish population. And so he had very, very little meat to give out. And so he divided in a way that everyone got really just a piece for Shabbat. And so he's giving out the pieces, and he gets down to literally the last piece, and a poor person comes in. But at the same time, one of the richest people in town comes in, and the rich person says, I heard that you have some meat. It's the only meat available. And so for the honor of Shabbat, could you please give me a piece of meat? And he said, I'm so sorry, but I only have one piece left, and I was about to give it to this person here. And the rich person was like, what do you mean? I support half of this town. How could you give it to this nobody and not give it to me? And the Ohr HaChaim didn't say anything, but he gave the piece to the poor person. And the rich person stormed out in a rage. And the Ohr HaChaim pretty much forgot about it because he felt he did the right thing. That night, he had a dream. And in the dream, an angel came to him and said, you have to know that on high in the heavenly court, what you did today was looked upon as very wrong. And in the dream, the Ohr HaChaim couldn't understand, because he understood that if he would have given it to the rich person, that would have been wrong, because he was already about to give it to the poor person, and that was his main purpose, is to support the poor people. And the angel explained to him, the problem was this rich person embarrassed the poor person, and you didn't speak up. You were silent. And you have no idea how embarrassed the poor person was. Despite the fact you gave him the piece of meat, he was mortified that he was embarrassed like that. And the angel said, therefore, it's been decreed that you need to go into exile for 1 year. What this means, in those years, it was very common for people to go in what was called exile, where they would leave family, they would leave all security, and they would wander from town to town with no money in order to feel the fullness of the exile, and especially the exile of the Shekhinah, God's divine presence. So he woke up from his dream. He didn't say anything to his family, but right after Shabbos, he explained to them what had happened and that he had to go into exile. So he does. He goes into exile. He wanders from town to town. And it wasn't easy. It was not easy at all. And no one knew who he was. This is before mass communication. And even though he was the Rav of this very prominent town, and word of the Ohr HaChaim had spread all over Morocco, but no one knew what he looked like. No one knew who he was. And so he was incognito. So one Erev Shabbos, he is traveling from town to town, and he is very tired. And so he sits down under a tree. He has a chumash with him, and he opens to this parsha, Bechukotai. That's why I'm telling this story. And he starts learning the first verse. And in a flood of inspiration, he comes up with 14 innovative ideas about the first verse in this parsha. And it's coming to him so quickly. He took a stick and he started writing these ideas in the sand. And when this influx of inspiration stopped, he went over these 14 innovations, and he was a kind of neshama that it just became integrated. He gets up and he continues his journey to this town. Again, it was a long journey. He sits down again, and the same thing happens. He opens a chumash, and another 14 innovative ideas come to him. He writes them in the sand. To make a long story short, a third time, another 14, 3 times 14, 42 different ideas, chidushim, came to him. He gets to the town, and what he has been doing, he, like any other poor person, they go to the synagogue, and after the prayers, they are invited to people's houses to have a meal or to stay, and if not, they would sleep in the Beit Knesset. So he's invited to a person's house, and as the meal concludes, the man says, "It's our custom in this town to go to the house of our Rav, and he's a great Torah scholar, and he's a mystic, and he gives over Torah. So please come with us and you'll be able to partake." So he goes, and this Rav is really a great Rav. And he's sitting there in deep thought, almost unworldly kind of meditation. And then he begins to give over Torah. And what is the Torah he's giving over? The same 14 innovative ideas that came to the Ohr HaChaim. And when the Rav finished, he says, "I heard these Torahs from the great Torah scholar, Rabbi Chaim ben Attar." That was the Ohr HaChaim's name, Rabbi Chaim ben Attar. So the Ohr HaChaim, who's sitting there listening to this, is like, he just intuitively, he gets up and he says, Chaim ben Atar. Now, in Morocco at that time, protocol was very, very important. You don't address like a great, great Torah scholar without saying Rebbe Chaim ben Atar. And so all the people like turned on him and like, shh, like, what are you saying? Sit down. That's terrible. It's Rebbe Chaim ben Atar, the great Ohr HaChaim. Of course, they didn't know it was him. To make a long story short, after lunch, they go back to the house of the Rav. He's deep in thought. He gives over 14 more chidushim, and he says, I heard all of these innovative Torahs from the great Ohr HaChaim, Rebbe Chaim ben Atar. And again, the Ohr HaChaim gets up in total surprise and says, Chaim ben Atar. And everyone, like this time, like they push him down and like, don't you dare do that again. How can you address the great Ohr HaChaim without saying Rebbe Chaim ben Atar? It happens the third time at third meal. And this time they say, we're taking you to a Beit Din. We're going to have a court case and you're going to be punished for your public behavior. So they put him in a room and the congregation davens Marav, the evening prayer. And before they do Havdalah, an angel comes to the Rav of the town, the one who gave over these Torahs. And he says, do you know who you put in that room? That is the Ohr HaChaim. And you have to know that all of the souls, the tradition is that souls in Gehenna is the Hebrew word for hell. It's not exactly the Christian version of hell. It's more like a cleansing period that a person goes through when they leave this world, if needed. And on Shabbos, they're let out of Gehenna. They don't have the experience of Gehenna. But the angel said, it's time that all these souls go back, but they can't go back because Rebbe Chaim ben Atar has not made Havdalah yet. And so the angel said, so go in there and release him and apologize and also tell him that now that he's experienced public embarrassment, his exile period is over. And so the Rav went in there and with, tremendous apologies for himself and the whole town. And right then they made Havdalah and the Ohr HaChaim was able to return home. So this is just a classic story. Now the amazing thing is he's called the Ohr HaChaim because that's the name of the book that he wrote. This is very typical in Judaism, that a person is called by the name of the book that they became famous through. So his famous book to this day is called the Ohr HaChaim. When you go to Parashat Bechukotai, there are 42 explanations of the beginning of the Parsha. He remembered all of them and he put them in his explanation of the opening of this week's Parsha. So it's just really a tremendous thing. I'm going to give over just a few of them. because I do want to get to this other Torah insight as well. So, first of all, im bechukotai telechu. The word bechukotai is plural, and yet it's written without. It's called chaser. Usually, it would be written with a vav, bechukotai. But in the opening verse, it is written without the vav. And so therefore, what's interesting is when you look at a chumash, usually they'll write out the word bechukotai with the vav. But if you actually look in the Torah, in the first verse, it's written without a vav. So here, it's plural, but because it's written without a vav, it also has the essence of unity of opposites. So the first Torahs that the Ohr HaChaim gives over is based on this idea that there's a plurality here. So one of the things he says, if my decrees you walk in, so because it's plural, the Ohr HaChaim says this is hinting to the written Torah and the oral Torah. And yet, those two Torah, they're not two separate Torahs. That's what makes up one Torah. And yet, there is a difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah. And yet they are unified. He says also that we have a mitzvah. It's based on a verse. He got to bo yamam v'layla. You shall be involved in learning Torah day and night. So he says that's one of the hints of why it's written in the plural. Because remember what Rashbi says, it's amal b'Torah, to be involved in learning Torah. And so the Ohr HaChaim says yomam v'layla, day and night. But we know from the creation, where each day ends, Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Voker, Yom Echad. The first day ends, it was evening, it was day, one day. Meaning that there's a unity between evening and morning, between darkness and light. He also says that it's in the plural because when we learn, we should learn for ourselves and we should learn to give it over to others. And again, that's why it's written in the plural. That because it could just say, the Torah could have just said, if you walk in my Torah. And the Torah we would understand as being in the singular. But the fact that it says Bechukotai, the Ohr HaChaim is finding all these different ways that it's including different aspects, sometimes even opposite aspects. He continues and he says, based on the word telechu, that you shall walk in my ways. So here he brings down the idea of that you shall learn Torah. We say this in the Shema, in the first passage, when we're sitting in our house and we're walking on the way. So again, both. It's not just when you're home and secure and have time, but even when you're on the way, you should make time to be thinking or learning about or discussing with others Torah. So again, all of these are based on the idea of the plurality, but with the unity between them. And he bases a number of insights on the idea of walking with the Torah. So of course, one of the things is that's what we call Jewish law, is halacha, from the word to walk. And that's hinted in this parsha. Im bechukotai tilecho, if you walk in my ways. meaning the law is a progressive, dynamic type of law. It's not just black and white and just put it in a book and you have the law. You don't have to like delve into it. No, it's always being developed. That's the oral Torah. And that's based on the verse, B'chal derechecha de'ehu. In all of your ways, walking in God's ways, you should know him. And already last week in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, that actually was one of the greatest teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. This idea of knowing God in all of your ways, not just in the religious sense, but even in our mundane pursuits to know God. And one last insight that I'll bring, remember there are 42, I'm just bringing a handful, is he says that this idea of the plurality of walking in my decrees and being involved in the Torah, so the Ohr HaChaim says this is the idea of learning according to Pardes. Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. It's not just a singular way to learn Torah. There's the literal meaning, there's the alluded to, there's the allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic meaning of the Torah, and then there's the secret mystical level of the Torah. That's Pardes. And he goes further, he said, and that's also the idea of Shivim Panim LeTorah, 70 faces to the Torah. That there's a plurality of perspectives in understanding the Torah. Okay, so with that, we'll conclude this first insight. And it's just amazing how it's connected, because on Tuesdays we're learning about the Baal Shem Tov, and here much of the ways that the Ohr HaChaim learned the text was very similar to how the Baal Shem Tov was learning the text. He was revealing these deeper meanings, many different perspectives, and that is in a great measure why the Baal Shem Tov wanted to get together with him. So he felt they were kindred spirits, and together they could bring the Mashiach. Okay, now we're going to learn one of the verses at the end of this parsha, and we're going to see its connection to Lag BaOmer, to today. So at the end of the 49 curses that we spoke about, so it ends in the following way. Yet even this, when they are in, this is God speaking, yet even this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I am not revolted by them, nor am I sickened by them, to annihilate them, to violate my covenant with them. For I am God, their God, and I shall remember them the covenant of the forefathers. That's how this series of blessings and curses ends, by God saying, even though I've exiled them, even though we're told that these 49 curses are connected to the destruction of the first temple, and the curses in the book of Devarim, in the Parsha of Kitavo, where there's exactly double. Here there's 49 curses, there's 98 curses. We're told that those are relating more to the destruction of the second temple and the subsequent exile. So this, though, these curses end with God saying, even though I've destroyed the temple, I've sent them into exile. I am not revolted by them. I am not sickened by them, and I won't violate my covenant. In the book of Devarim, it actually goes one step further, where God says, and I will eventually bring them back to the land, and they will be even more blessed than even the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and hinting at the Messianic era that will follow. So here I'm reading a passage from the Zohar. As we know, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is along with Rabbi Akiva, are the main figures of Lag BaOmer. So he is the one who began the tradition that ended up being the book of the Zohar. So here, Rabbi Akiva gives over a Torah from Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar is the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was with him in the cave for 12 years. There's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son in the cave for 12 years. And this is a Torah that he gave over. So he quotes this verse, and he says that the reason that God says, I'm not sickened by them and I won't despise them, he said the reason is because the one that I love is amongst them. And he brings a parable. What's the parable? There is a man who is in love with a woman who lives in the leather shuk. Now, tanneries give off a terrible smell. The process of making leather is not a pleasant process, and it puts out a terrible smell. And the parable is that the man, if he wasn't connected to this woman, he would never go to the leather shuk. It was an unpleasant experience. But since his beloved is in the leather shuk, not only does he go, but all he can smell is a good scent. Why? Because he's drawn to his beloved. And so Reb Elazar says that's what this verse is hinting to. That God says, even in their exile, even in the lands of their enemies, the one that I love, the Shekhinah, and all of Israel. The Shekhinah is God's divine presence. And we know that when Yaakov went down to Egypt, the verse says, I will go down with you, and I will surely bring you out. And the words, I will surely bring you out, is a double language. So it's explained that God says, I will bring you out, but I will come out with you as well. In other words, God sends his own divine presence into exile to be with the Jewish people. And in Kabbalah, the totality of the Jewish people, called Knesset Yisrael, is equated, is synonymous with the Shekhinah. And so Rabbi Elazar says that's why God is not sickened by Israel who's in exile, because it's his beloved. And so therefore he's willing to go to the leather shuk in order to bring his beloved out. And he explains that in the Hebrew, where it says that God says, I am not sickened by them, to annihilate them, lechalotam. So Reb Elazar said we can read the word differently, because this word is also written without a vav, and therefore it can be read, the word for a bride is kala. So here he reads the word, the reason that I will bring them out and I'm not sickened by them because my bride is amongst them. So this is an amazing insight from the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right after that, in the Zohar, the same person who brings this whole story, was Rabbi Yossi, heard that Rabbi Elazar said that, but he brings another teaching that seems not to have any connection. And it's a verse from Mishlei that says, a son honors his father and a servant his master. And he says, so who is the son here who honors his father? It's Rabbi Elazar. So how is he honoring his father? He's honoring his father because he is adopting the ways of his father. So for this, we have to try to understand why is he adopting the ways of his father? Because here we see Reb Elazar is defending the Jewish people, is looking at the Jewish people even while they're in exile, and even in a state where they're surrounded by a bad smell. And they got themselves, like this parsha says, that if we would have done everything we were supposed to do, we would have only blessings. There would be no exile. So obviously we're in exile because of a measure for measure. But here, Reb Elazar is defending the Jewish people and saying how much God loves the Jewish people despite almost forcing God to send us into exile. So the way we understand this is in the following story. When Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what happened is he spoke badly about the Romans. And when the Romans heard, they put a death penalty on him because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is very influential. And they can't have someone going around speaking bad about the Romans. The Romans are ruling Israel. Israel is practically decimated. This is after the destruction of the temple and the failure of the Bar Chachma revolt. Israel is like really in a terrible way here. And the Romans have full control, but they're not going to allow anyone to speak badly about them because they just finished putting down the Bar Chachma revolt. So Rabbi Shimon and his son have to escape, and they're in a cave for 12 years. This is where the seed of the Zohar comes from. They delve into the Torah in great depth, and with help from on high, they have the mystical tradition that they're now going to hand over. So the story is that after 12 years, a voice comes from heaven and says, who is going to tell Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that the emperor is dead and the decree is canceled? Meaning you can come out of the cave. So he and his son come out of the cave. Now, this is after 12 years of doing nothing but learning Torah and delving into the very depths of the Torah. They come out and they see people working, just doing mundane things. And it's like, how can people just not be sitting and learning Torah? And so this is a whole Torah in the Gemara. And it says everywhere they looked, they burned everything up. Now, this is not literal. It just means the fire of judgment. They were judging everyone in a very negative way. So a voice comes from heaven and says, I didn't let you out of the cave for you to destroy my world. Go back to the cave. So they go back to the cave for another year. And again, a voice comes from heaven and says, you can go out of the cave now. This time they come out of the cave, and it says that everywhere Rabbi Elazar looks, he's still burning up people. It's as if he didn't learn anything from the extra year in the cave. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, everywhere his son burns up people, he now heals them. And part of the story is they meet an old man. And it's right before Shabbat. And he has 2 bundles of myrtle, hadass. And Rabbi Shimon says to him, why do you have hadass? And he says, it's a good smell for Shabbat. And you should know, to this day, especially by Sephardim, Friday night before they make Kiddush, they'll make a blessing on something good smelling. And this is probably the source for that custom. And we're going back 2,000 years. And so Rabbi Shimon says, but why 2 bundles of hadass? In other words, one bundle be enough? And the man says, one is for shamor and one is for zachor. We're told this is the opening of Lecha Dodi, the beloved song of Friday night. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur achad. In the first luchot, the first of the tablets of law, it says to remember the Shabbat. And in the second, it says to guard the Shabbat. Shamor v'zachor. Excuse me. And when Rabbi Shimon heard this, it was like, he says, and he thinks to himself, I've been judging people like so harshly. Here's a simple Jew who honors Shabbat so beautifully. Like I didn't get it. I didn't understand. And this was a total transformation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It took 13 years, but he is transformed, but his son isn't yet. But after Rabbi Shimon dies, that's when the story that we just read in the whole parable of the leather shuk. And that's why Rabbi Yossi says, who's an example of a son who honors his father? He explains that the greatest honor that a son or daughter can give to a parent is by emulating their ways, by carrying on their traditions. That's the greatest honor that a child can do to a parent, is to carry on their traditions. So here we see that finally Reb Elazar buys into, he's influenced by his father, and he also, it transforms his fiery nature into a nature that's more willing to defend Israel, even those who have fallen, who have not done right, who have sinned. So here, this idea, I want to continue with this idea that the bonfires, hopefully everyone had a chance to experience last night, the big thing, the big custom is to have a bonfire for Lag BaOmer, and it represents the fire of Torah. The Torah is called Eish Dat Lamo, a fiery law. When the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, it says that the mountain was on fire because God came down on the mountain. And in the book of Devarim, God is called a consuming fire. And yet, when God appears to Moshe at the burning bush, the whole idea was the bush was on fire, but it was not consumed. And so this represents, in the case that we're talking about, judgment is very fiery. It burns people up, not literally, but when people judge other people, it's a fiery kind of judgment. But here we see that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and eventually his son were able to transform the fire of judgment into a more positive kind of fire. And that's represented by the bonfire. And there's a beautiful connection with the burning bush here, is that we're told that in the first day of creation, the word light appears 5 times. And when God appeared to Moshe at the burning bush, the word bush, snah, appears 5 times. So the reason that the bush was not consumed, because it wasn't a physical fire. It was the fire, the light of the first day of creation, which God hid away. And we're told, well, where did he hide it? In the Torah. And that was, when they were in the cave for 12 years, they were so involved in the Torah, in the fire of the Torah, the light of the Torah, but they hadn't, in a sense, fixed their midot to know how to deal with this fire in relationship to other people. And here we can see this kind of transformational fire in a Gemara about the students of Hillel HaZaken. This is an amazing Gemara. It's in Sukkot, in the tractate of Sukkot 28a, if anyone wants to see it. And it says like this, that Hillel, the great Hillel, had 80 students. 30 of them had Ruach HaKodesh, had divine inspiration. In other words, they had a sense of prophecy. Another 30 were worthy that the sun should stand still for them if they wanted. This is like, and it says like Yoshua. Just like Yoshua stopped the sun, 30 of his students were on that level that if needed, they could stop the sun. Then it says, and so who is the greatest of them? Yonatan ben Uziel. His gravesite is about 20 minutes outside of Tzfat. I've gone there many, many times. It's in a beautiful place called Amuka. And what is said about him? It says that when he would sit and learn Torah, that if a bird passed over his head while he was learning, no matter how high it would be burnt up. Now, again, we don't take this literally, but it means that his passion, his focus, his concentration was so fiery that it was like the fire on Mount Sinai. So he was the greatest of the students. And so they said, but what about the least of them? What level was he on? So who was that? The great Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest of the sages. He was considered the least of the students of Hillel. So then they explained, well, what level was he on? So in short, it explains he knew the whole Torah backwards and forwards, inside and out. But along with that, he was a master of all kinds of parables. He knew the secrets of computing the Hebrew calendar, which is very, very complex. He knew gematrias. He knew the speech of the angels. He knew the speech of different spirits, the speech of palm trees. And great matters. What are the great matters? Maaseh Merkavah, the secrets of the divine chariot. So here, the greatest of them could burn up a bird flying who knows how high over its head. And this is the least of them. So later, this is attributed to the Kotzker Rebbe. His son asked him, well, what about the level of Hillel? Here we get an explanation of the greatest of his students, the least of his students. 60 of them are an incredible level. When Hillel would learn, what would happen? So you might expect like an atomic bomb would go off, figuratively. And so the Kotzker Rebbe said nothing would happen. Meaning he was so in tune with his fire. He was so in control of his fiery Torah, nothing would happen. And so this is the transformation that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai went through. This whole story of Hillel and Yochanan and Zakkai is before Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And so his transformation was from a physical fire, in a sense, to a spiritual fire that he could emanate. I want to add here, though, that along with these different ideas from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there are a number of stories in the Gemara where Rabbi Shimon says about himself that he can alleviate, he can nullify judgment from the beginning of creation to his own time. And there's a number of statements, and it sounds almost egotistical. He makes a number of statements that he is unique in his generation, and he can nullify judgments. And the Zohar tells a number of stories. We don't have time to go through the full stories, but on a number of occasions, Rabbi Shimon senses that there's a tremendous judgment about to come down in the world, to the point of even destroying the world. And in both cases, he stands up, and in one case, an angel comes, and there's darkness all over. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "God sent me to destroy the world." And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, "You go back to God and tell him Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is in the world." Meaning, I will not allow this to happen. And the angel goes back. God says, don't listen to him. Go back and destroy the world. You have to understand this is a parable. This is a metaphor. He goes back, and this time, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says to the angel, I'm going to throw you to the deepest depths of Gehenna, and you'll never escape. And at that point, a voice comes out of heaven and says, blessed are you, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that you've learned the lesson of you become the greatest defender of the Jewish people. And there are a number of stories like this where he says, I can alleviate judgment for the whole generation. That's why there's a tradition that in the generation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the rainbow, there was never a rainbow. In the original covenant that God makes with Noach, he says that this is the sign that I will not destroy the world through water for all the generations, and the word generations could be written with two vavs, or just one vav, or no vavs. There, it's written with no vavs. So the sages learned from this. It's hinting that there were two generations where the rainbow never showed, meaning because there was a great person in the generation, there was no need to show a rainbow. A rainbow is beautiful. Everyone loves looking at rainbows, but it also has a message of heavy judgment that God did destroy the world through water once. And so one version is it was in the generation of Chizkiyahu. The king Chizkiyahu was from the house of David HaMelech. And that's when the Assyrians tried to capture Jerusalem. They had already exiled the 10 tribes, and they were about to destroy the other 2 tribes. It would have been the end of the Jewish people. And God made a tremendous miracle for Chizkiyahu, and the Assyrians left. Sennacherib left. And so they said that in his generation, a rainbow didn't show, and also the generation of the Anshe Knesset Gedola, the men of the Great Assembly, when they first began. But the other version is, instead of the Anshe Knesset Gedola, it was a generation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So again, in his generation, there was no need for this symbol of judgment, because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had such a love for the Jewish people that he wouldn't allow this kind of destruction to happen. Now, what is interesting here, and hopefully everyone will forgive me, we're going a little bit longer than usual, but I want to finish this idea, is according to the Arizal, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a reincarnation of Moshe. And their lives are very similar, just like Moshe reveals the revealed Torah, Rabbi Shimon reveals the hidden Torah. Just like Moshe had to flee Egypt, and he was in exile for 40 years before God appeared to him in the burning bush, that Rabbi Shimon was in the cave for 12 years. And both of them had reason to maybe give up or not want to take a leadership role. But they both were able to transform themselves in a way that they became the great defenders of Israel. Just like these stories we just told of Rabbi Shimon, Moshe Rabbeinu became the greatest defender. And we see all, and one last thing here. One last thing is, after he comes out of the cave, so Rabbi Shimon gathers a small group of students, and he gives over these mystical teachings. Now remember, this is after the destruction of the temple. It's after his Rabbi Akiva, was tortured to death. And this is also the idea of the 10 martyrs. This is after the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. It was a very difficult time, extremely difficult. But if you look historically, from the time that we came into Israel, approximately 1300 BCE, until Rabbi Shimon is around 1450 years. When you look at the Tanakh, we'll see there's nothing but war after war after war after war. And the Tanakh ends before the Greeks before the Romans. It's just war after war, generation after generation. And at one point, Rabbi Shimon gathers his students together, and he now wants to give over the depths of the mystic tradition. And it's called, a section of the Zohar is called the Idra Rabbah, the great threshing floor, or the great gathering in the threshing floor. There were really only 10 people there. But these 10 people carried on the tradition of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the teachings that he gave over, which were eventually codified in what we call the Zohar. And at this Idra Rabbah, so he begins by saying, more or less, damned if I do and damned if I don't. Meaning, if I give over these teachings, it's not so simple. They're very, very powerful. But if I don't give them over, like, what's going to happen to the mystic tradition? And so he begins to give over these teachings. It's one of the deepest parts of the Zohar. It's actually quite difficult to understand. But right at the beginning, he starts talking about judgment. And then he says a simple statement, but it's one of the transformational points in Jewish history. And he says, and now for us, everything depends on love. This is a statement, but it's more than a statement. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is signaling that the fight, the war, they're over. We can't do this anymore. We won't survive as a people in this way. The only way we're going to survive is through love of each other, love of God, and love of Torah. That is how we will survive until the time of the Messianic era. And that became a watershed in Jewish history, because after that, the revolts were over. Israel was stuck in exile, but we survived. We survived. We were defenseless. We could not fight back. We were at the whim of whatever nation we were in, and we experienced not only the exile, but the inquisitions, the crusades, the expulsions, the pogroms, the ghettos, the Holocaust, but we survived. Now we can defend ourselves, and of course it has much to do with the situation today. That after the Holocaust, it got to a place that either we defend ourselves or we could be destroyed. Never again. But from the time that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, and now for us, all depends on love, that became our ticket to survival. And it still is. Because if we think that only defending ourselves is going to ensure our survival, we are very wrong. Without the love of Torah, the love of God, the love of the Jewish people, and the love of the land of Israel, we will not be able to survive. So this, not only did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai transform himself, and here we see his son transformed himself. And we didn't go in depths, but Moshe Rabbeinu was able to transform himself. Remember at the burning bush, he stood there for a week saying, I can't do it, pick someone else, I'm not the right person. But he also said, they're not on the level to be saved. And that's why God said, put your hand in your chest, and it came out leprous with sarat, because he said lashon hara against the Jewish people. And yet Moshe was able to transform his consciousness, and he became the greatest defender of Israel. So we'll end with this idea of we have both realities here: the need to defend ourselves, but the need that everything is based on love now. And somehow, hopefully, we can defend ourselves, but then spread that teaching to the world, that will be the love of the Messianic era, that will spread to all mankind, that we will all come together. And it says in the Zohar, on the merit of learning the mystical tradition as given over in the Zohar, we will come out of exile and we will be redeemed with compassion. May we see those days. Bezrat Hashem.